solar. So a lot of people get tricked out and tripped up on buying a property with solar, selling the property with solar. What do we do with solar? So guess who takes care of it? Rudy does with Foundation Escrow. So he'll get in the weeds a little bit about it, because I even have people who want to purchase a home that I have listed, and they're all kind of tripped up on the solar. And so I think it's important to touch on that, because so many homes now have leased solar, paid out solar. What do we do? Yeah, go for it.
So for me, us as escrow, I would say I'm probably one of the rarities. I love solar and I love dealing with it, because I think it's a concept that's neglected or not fully understood to the capacity that it could be, where it's actually a very simple process. It's not as scary as people think. Typically, whenever we open escrow, I will ask the agent, hey, is there solar on the property? And they will say yes or no. But in the instance that there is, I always defer to the contract right away. So usually on the contract, some agents, some not, they will include what to do with solar. So for example, if the solar is leased, some will put, hey, solar to be transferred, but then also some will say, hey, it's owned. But typically I always still ask, because you can always process solar even if it's owned and even if it's transferable during escrow. In the instance where I see it on the contract and it is transferable, us as escrow will find out who the solar company is, either through asking the agent or asking the seller. Or also looking at the title report when we get it, in terms of if there's any liens. Once we find out who the solar company is, I can call them to get their process. So for example, we open an escrow, Addie, for example, tells me, hey, Rudy, solar's with Tesla. And then when I get the title report, I see a couple liens pertaining to solar and Tesla on there. So I know, hey, perfect. I'm going to reach out to Tesla, initiate what's called the solar transfer. And typically, again, it depends on the solar company. Us as escrow, when we call to initiate, companies like Tesla will say, hey, wait a minute, you need to have the seller call.
Right.
So you'll have some instances where the seller themselves, since they're the current owner of solar, will need to reach out to their solar company and say, hey, I'm now an escrow, I want to initiate it. And typically what the solar companies will do is say, perfect, I will assign you what's called a case number, which is basically a reference number that you can call in. And I always tell sellers and agents, make sure when you're dealing with solar, get a case number.
Okay, good.
So that way you can always reference who your actual case, you have a paper trail. And typically once they assign that, the solar company will ask your seller, hey, can you provide us the buyer information? Typically, they're not going to be privy to that information.
Right.
So I always tell agents and always tell sellers, if you're going to go out and initiate solar yourself, have them email us, and then we will provide them the buyer information.
Okay.
And we'll take over from there. So usually,
We love that.
Usually with solar,
Take it over.
with Tesla, they'll email us and say, please provide us buyer information. We will send them that information via email. Also call them to confirm that they received it, because sometimes they don't reply. And then again, with every solar company, they will do, depending on their requirements, they will perhaps want to run a credit check, where if it's a lease or if it's a loan.
Right.
They want to make sure the client qualifies as a listing agent, as well as a buyer's agent, or if you're a more specific listing, when you're communicating with the buyer's agent, let them know that, hey, this solar company does have a credit check. So that way, perhaps if that buyer, the potential buyer, is getting a loan, that can be communicated to the buyer. So that way, that's the expectation that, hey, you will have to file an application. They will run your credit. It may ding it a little bit because it's a credit check. Check with your lender as well if you have a lender, because also in terms of like running credit, you don't want their credit score to dip. I had a file like that where briefly they did a credit check through the solar company. It brought down their credit score and it hurt them in terms of the loan. So if you know that already, by asking your seller, talking to the solar company directly, you can pass that information to the buyer to say, hey, is this offer even worth it? Not so much in terms of, does the solar itself work, but also can they even qualify?
Right. Well, that's good. Actually, that's really good to know. Okay.
So typically, if there is a credit check, once they pass it, the solar company will let us know as escrow saying, hey, the client has passed the credit check. We will now issue what's called a solar transfer agreement. That solar transfer agreement typically can be e-signed. For example, with Tesla, they usually use Adobe Sign. They don't use DocuSign. They'll send one portion to the buyer to sign. They're the assignee, meaning that they're receiving the solar agreement. And then they will also send a portion to your seller, the assignor. It can be e-signed. And then typically, once that's officialized in terms of being fully executed, they will send us a copy. I will send that copy to all agents. Here for your records. I will also, in the instance where there's a lender involved, I will send them that transfer agreement, because one of the components of their loan, they're most likely going to want the signed transfer agreement. And then typically with solar companies, once the transfer agreement is signed, they will release any liens on title. So this is where I think communication will fall apart, is with escrow companies. Oftentimes when they're communicating the time frame to the agents, they need to make sure they stay on top of the releases of the liens, because those are where they can take long. The transfer process in terms of the agreement is usually fairly quickly processed if you can do it right away, the credit check and stuff like that. But the liens themselves can take long, because oftentimes some of these releases that the solar companies will give to escrow have to be actually physically notarized and then sent to them to be recorded. So more specifically, the two most common liens that have to be released part of solar is that you see on the title report is the financing statement, which actually is formalizing that there is an actual finance going on between the consumer, the client, the current owner, and the solar company. That's usually when there's a financing statement on the title report. As an agent and as a seller, you should know that you're going to need what's called a UCC termination. So the acronym, I don't recall what it stands for, but essentially it's a release.
Okay.
It's a release of that specific lien. And typically when it's solar, obviously once you get the transfer agreement, you as escrow need to make sure that you ask for that UCC. Because it's a termination saying, hey, we as a solar company are transferring to a new owner. That financing statement that pertains to the previous owner is null and void. Let's terminate it. Typically with UCC terminations, you do not need the original. They don't notarize it. It's usually a 3-page document that says, hey, we are now releasing the seller of this lien. Hey, escrow, please give this to your title company so they can record it at closing. Those are usually fairly quick to get. But again, as an agent, as a seller, if you know you have solar and you have a PR, for example, a title report prior to going into escrow, get on top of that, because that's where you can stall your deal.
Well, it's true, because I had one kind of stall. I was on the listing side, and the buyers couldn't take over that lease because it was expensive. It was like $250 a month.
Yeah.
And that hurt them with the lender in order to purchase the house.
Yeah.
So that was a big bummer.
So knowing that, so I would say again, just to rehash, definitely make sure that you know the process in terms of, hey, do they do a credit check? How quickly can they transfer the solar? Meaning, how quickly can they send up the transfer agreement to be signed, as well as how quickly can they make sure that they release the liens? And like I said earlier, the main one is the financing statement. You want a UCC termination, usually a 3-page document. It'll reference the original lien. It'll say it's now released. The escrow company will give it the title. They will record it at closing. The second lien, it's not really a lien, but on resales, when you're selling a home, you want to make sure you terminate it. It's called a notice of independent solar contract. It's just literally like an advisory document that the solar company would have recorded when they put the lien on the finance statement originally, saying like, hey, we have an agreement. It's just a notice. It's not a lien.
Okay.
But most title companies, and typically if there's a lender involved, they want that item gone too.
Sure,
They don't
get it
want,
off.
Yeah.
Sure.
Usually with that, every solar company you'll find, depending on Tesla, Sunrun, they will call that release a different thing. So as you recall earlier with the financing statement, you get a UCC.
Yeah.
They all call it UCC for that item.
Okay.
But for the termination of solar contract, some solar companies will call it a PUC. Some will call it an NOI PC. They all have different acronyms, but at the end of the day, they're the same thing.
Okay.
I would always say when you're speaking to a solar company as escrow, as an agent, if you have to call as your seller, when you advise them, just let them know we want a termination of independent solar contract. That's with this document specifically, every solar company is different. Like I mentioned earlier, the UCC can be electronically done and then just send it to you. But usually for this document, for this termination, some solar companies will actually have to physically notarize it and then overnight it to you.
Okay, so I could hiccup it a bit.
Exactly.
So get on it at the
You
beginning.
want that original. Like Tesla, for example, they will notarize it. They have their company is based in Utah, their solar division, so they will notarize it with an actual physical notarization. They will ask escrow for a FedEx label to overnight it.
Got it.
You want that prior to closing. In the instance where you're dealing with a company like Sunrun, they DocuSign their forms.
Yeah.
So even though it's a termination, and most companies don't really, do e-sign stuff like that with regards to terminations.
Yeah.
This company
Yeah,
does.
yeah, we have them and they do.
So again, when you're as an agent, when you're talking to your seller, getting the general process, if you already know what your liens are, you can dial that in already.
Oh,
So
good
that
to
way,
know.
if, for example, your upcoming listing, if it has solar, for example, you can let me know and say, hey, Rudy, it's with Tesla.
Got it.
And then I could already know, ding, 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 I got to get a UCC and I got to get
Oh, good to know.
a notice of termination of the contract.
Okay.
And I know that one needs an original.
So really for you, you want their loan statement, and
Yeah.
if they have,
Their original
solar-
agreement, yeah.
Yeah, and then, I mean, loan statement, like, for just selling the house.
Like their solar agreement?
No, I mean, off that, but like upfront, if I
Oh,
have.
yes,
Yeah,
like the
if
mortgage-
I-
like the mortgage
Yeah, like the
information.
mortgage statement, and then you want the solar
Solar.
information right up front.
Yeah,
That's good.
more specifically for solar, right when we go into escrow, or if you already have it, ask for the original solar agreement.
Okay.
Because typically for those is, again, if you have a lender, they're gonna want that because typically it'll show the monthly payment.
Yeah,
And they want to encompass that in their DTI calculation.
okay, good idea.
So they will ask for that one.
Okay.
If they don't ask for it on day one, they're going to ask for it 5 days within.
So we
escrow.
should get that.
So typically, if you're accepting an offer as a listing agent with solar involved, and you know that there's liens on title, but a lender is going to ask you for stuff, you want to make sure you have the transfer agreement, which we'll do midway through escrow.
Yeah.
But you also upfront want to make sure you have the original solar agreement.
Got it. Okay,
Because
good to know.
for DTI calculation, stuff like that, as well as for solar, you want to make sure that with regards to giving stuff to the lender, that anything that they need right away, it's done. Because I've had deals hold up because lenders are saying this is our last condition with solar.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay,
so
good to know.
Stuff like that. With regards to other companies, you will have it where some solar companies will require an upfront fee. So like Tesla, for example, if you're doing a solar transfer for a resale, they usually tell your seller that they have to pay $150 upfront. So one of the things that they'll do is they'll say, hey, Addie, tell your seller that if they have an account with us online, they have to go and make the request for the solar transfer on their Tesla portal,
Okay,
pay the $150, and then we'll talk and we'll begin the process.
good old Tesla.
Other companies like SunPower, which by the way, I just found this out recently, they're going through bankruptcy.
Oh,
So if you have a file with SunPower,
No, not right now.
that might delay your file because their
interesting.
processing timelines right now are taking like 15 to 20 days. Because I believe they're in the process of being bought out by a new company who's going to basically take over all their files, which is a different story, but definitely.
Yeah.
SunPower, for example,
That's good to
they make you pay a $300 processing fee, and they also make you pay the monthly balance at closing.
well, they're going BK, they need their money now.
So-
Oh, shit.
But you will have some companies where it's one of the prerequisites would be,
Yeah.
okay, we'll process your transfer, but we want to make sure we get paid our monthly dues
Sure,
during escrow.
okay.
So again, ask that question to your seller. Hey, give me the original agreement. What's the time frame? What's the process? Are there any upfront fees? If there are, let me know. Because from a negotiation standpoint, when you're
Sure.
accepting offers, say for example with Tesla, again, everything's negotiable. When you do a SCO, seller counter,
Yeah.
you keep it like buyer agrees to pay the $150
Yeah, you good?
instead of having your seller do it. Again, your seller will love you that. Love you for
Yeah,
that
yeah,
even more.
no, good to know.
But things like that, as well as if you're dealing with the more like mom and pop solar company, like you have like Baker Electric, which is more localized, their process might be different. So again, when you're always determining who your solar company is, ask who the company is,
Good to know.
relay that back to your escrow. So that way we can find out as well, because
Yeah.
I've had files before where if it's a mom and pop local solar company, they'll charge like $600
Sure.
for processing.
They're like only a check.
Yeah, yeah, and then again, do they want it up front or do they
Right,
want it at
okay.
closing? So little things like
Oh, I
that
didn't even know this. This is good to know.
can create
Like
more
that, yeah.
fees, more headaches. I would say that's the most important thing when you're doing a transfer. Two other scenarios: when you have the solar when it's owned.
Mm-hmm.
What that means more so is I would still ask your client, hey, can you show me proof that it's paid?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, like in California, I've had a scenario where you have a buyer or a person that's selling, but they bought the house as a new build. So it came with solar
Yeah.
already. Still have some proof that the solar was encompassed in the purchase price or some way, somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've had that kill files where they didn't even have proof that it was owned. Even though that they knew it was owned, but they didn't have proof.
Oh, God.
So they had to go to the builder and say, can
Yeah,
you give me
sure.
proof that I bought it? So that's one thing to keep in mind. If they also have proof that they just paid it outright, make sure that they have what's called a paid in full letter.
Okay. Oh, good to know.
Because if you have a buyer that wants to see that, they want that as proof. But if they also have a lender, they want to see proof as well. Because
Good to know.
God forbid, they don't want to find out that there's a loan or something, right?
Sure.
And then also, if it's owned, typically I would also have your seller call their solar company to say, hey, while I have paid it off, is there any warranty that's associated with the solar that I need to transfer still?
Right.
Because us as escrow, when I go into escrow and I'm looking at the contract and you just write solar's owned.
Yeah.
And on the title report, I don't see anything with solar.
Sure, it's done.
It's not my obligation to handle it. But if you say, hey, Rudy, it's owned per the contract, but I also need to make sure that we transfer the warranty per the contract, then as escrow, I have the obligation now to reach out to that solar company and say, well, it's paid off, but I still need to transfer the warranty. And typically with warranty transfers, there is a fee to put you on the meter, to put you in the system. For example, Sunrun, for example, will make sure that the client has to fill out a warranty form, which basically is the seller has to sign it saying, hey, I hereby transfer the warranty only. Buyer signs it, and then there is a fee associated. I had a file probably 6 months ago where, again, they just told me it was paid off. They didn't tell me anything, nothing in the contract reference warranty. A buyer calls me and says, hey, we bought this property. We try to get set up in the system for Sunrun. Turns out there's a $450 processing fee. And we're like, well, us as escrow weren't instructed to follow up on anything. But again, if you as the agent are privy to that information that, hey, there is a warranty that still has to be transferred, put that in the contract. And also, who's going to pay for that fee? So that way us as escrow could be like, okay, I'm reaching out to the respective party that has to pay it. And that way I don't get a call 6 months later saying like, hey, who's going to pay this fee?
Oh, this is good. Yeah. No. I've had that with the transfer. Like, is there a warranty? Then there's no warranty.
Yeah,
I thought there was.
Because essentially with the transfer, you're transferring the ownership, but also if it's already paid off, you're not transferring ownership now. You're just transferring the warranty.
Warranty, yeah.
Which again,
if there is one.
Yeah, if there is. But I would always, as a listing agent, I would ask your seller to call and confirm that. So that way, when you're negotiating and doing counters, accepting offers,
we already know.
You know when you put in the contract. Because some agents you'll see they'll reference it like if there is any warranty.
It's in the documents.
Like on page 3 under section R under other terms, they'll write that seller to pay any fees.
Got it.
Just to save their butt.
Yeah.
But some agents won't know to do that.
Yeah, sure.
And so when you close, your buyer or your seller is going to call you and say, hey, I paid it off, or this was paid off, but there's still a warranty that still needs to be transferred. But us as escrow, we have our hands up and say, we're done. The third scenario is where you have it where you need to pay off the solar. Say for example, we go on a contract, the solar says pay off. So us as escrow, it's kind of similarly to like a mortgage. We will order a formal payoff demand.
Okay.
Usually 3 pages. It'll have the same jazz, principal balance, interest, any miscellaneous fees. But also, and this is the one part that I feel a lot of escrow companies neglect, is because remember when I referenced back to the title report where you have the financing statement? That still needs to be taken care of, right? Where if there's a financing statement, you need to make sure as escrow, and I would also as an agent, make sure you stay on top of your escrow company to say, hey, when you get this demand, you need to make sure that a UCC comes with it.
So it's totally done.
Yes, so that lien is totally paid, and also that lien is going to get removed. Some solar companies will give you a UCC attached to the payoff demand, so it's like a 2-part kind of document. But I would say 9 times out of 10, they'll just give you the payoff demand saying pay us, but they'll include a blurb at the bottom of the demand saying upon full payment, we will issue a UCC. What that essentially is saying is that, hey, escrow, we won't give you that UCC now, but once you pay us, we will file that UCC after the fact and record it and get rid of that lien. For most title companies, they will accept that.
Okay.
But if you get a payoff demand and you don't see anything referencing the UCC,
We got a problem.
you have a problem.
Yeah.
I had a file about a year ago where it was a credit union that controlled the loan for the solar company. So we didn't deal with the actual solar company. It was like Salal Credit Union. And so we ordered a payoff demand through Salal. It had all the right numbers and everything. Seller liked it in terms of making sure that it was correct, but they were missing that blurb of the UCC. So I had to call Salal and say, hey, my title company is not going to accept this because while we will pay you off, that doesn't take care of my lien on title because it doesn't make any reference to it. It just says pay me and that's it. So I call Salal. I have to speak with 3 different people. They didn't want to update their demand. They said, hey, our demand is formally generalized or generated, but we will send you an email. So as an agent or as an escrow company, when you guys are communicating about solar payoffs, let your escrow agent know that say, hey, if you can't get them to revise their payoff demand to reference that they will file you, get an email.
Yeah.
Because title companies, they'll accept that as long as it's in writing.
Right.
But again, you got to know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So whenever you're ordering a solar payoff, make sure you get the solar payoff and make sure it has reference to saying we will also file a UCC.
Well, see, it gets in the nitty gritty, and that's probably why it gets lost in
That's the devil's
translation.
details right there. Because you will have it where and that hasn't happened to me, but I've had it happen to other people where they'll order the demand, they're at closing, title says, well, this doesn't make any reference to our lien. This just says pay us, which we can pay, but how does this take care of our lien?
Right.
And then you're like, oh, damn, I didn't account for that. But I think that's what separates the good from the great is those details.
Right.
Is do you have the wherewithal to understand that I'm paying this person off, but I also need the lien to be taken care of? Because people think that, hey, as long as I get the payoff demand,
Yeah.
I'm done.
No.
But no, you always need verbiage. Similarly for a mortgage payoff. When you are going to pay this mortgage company off, they will always have verbiage and say, we will file a release. You know, that it has to be a give and take.
Right,
I
it
give
has
you
to get off.
I give you the money, you give me the release.
Yeah.
If you don't have that on there, I need something in writing to substantiate that. If not, we can't close our deal.
Yeah.
Because the title company, they're like, this is not a correct payoff demand.
Right.
It doesn't reference our file.
Right.
It just references an amount, but who do we know that this is just a random
Sure.
person? So again, as an agent, when you're communicating with your client, as an agent communicating with the escrow company, if you know about this information, all of this, it's great to have at the beginning of the transaction.
So just use Rudy and he'll get all the work done for you. You see, it's even better. There's so much nitty gritty when it comes to like a file of 15, 7 days, 30 days.
Yeah.
So we try to make it as easy as possible for our buyers and sellers. So that's why I use Rudy.
Thank
All
you.
right, you guys, that's all solar. We'll chat with you later.
Thank you.
Bye.